problems that in many cases all of us here have to deal with. So what we thought we'd do is we'd take a step back and say, how can we provide information, or at least steps, small steps, very, very small, easy steps that are fun for people. And basically, we don't pretend to be health experts or wellness experts at all. What we do is say, tell us who your wellness experts are. We'll take that material and we'll write it into cards that are, if any of you are old enough to remember Trivial Pursuit, where you're sort of intrigued to see what the answer might be when you scroll across the top. And so we take the content and we actually make it fun, and then we give it back to whoever the expert is and say, make sure that we didn't change it in a way that makes it inaccurate. And then we publish it. So we created gamification as a way, and we deal with the three legs of the stool: exercise, nutrition, and well-being, because you can't separate them. And what happens is people go through, jump off the deep end. We often talk about your rational mind. If someone said, we're going to teach you how to ski, but that's the hill, and the best way to get down it safely is you lean forward. Fear of failure, fear of not being able to do it, people back off. But if we nudge very gently and just say, do simple things, the way you would teach a kid how to play baseball. You don't say, stand up in front of a 90-mile-an-hour fastball. You introduce them to very, very simple things early on so that they start to get success, they get rewarded. So our gamification has a reward program behind it, and it also has community. So the other thing we do at ILM is the community is formed by whoever our client is. If it's people who are pre-diabetic, it's pre-diabetic. And Dennis, you asked about the program we're involved in. We're involved in a CHIPS program here in a major American city where we are baked into a solution that will be given to high school children.
How many?
250,000 to start off with. And the whole idea is to create an atmosphere where they get their friends playing the game as well, and where they're rewarded. The rewards could be, famous athletes coming to their school. It could be any number of things chosen again by the particular group that we're working with. But the idea is to just, if you would, introduce wellness light. Because if you don't introduce wellness light, it's very hard to go all the way to the next step.
So Rick, you mentioned the three things you're interested in. I think you're mistaken. I think there's four.
Yeah.
And I think the fourth is the most important one. I think you're trying to create mindfulness.
Yes.
And I think that's your main driver. Yeah. And then all these other things are a subset,
yes,
really, of that mindfulness. But what you bring to the table that's so important is that we often demand so much of people they feel that it's hopeless. And you bring the insight that small changes incrementally can make huge differences. And we all really, really understand how important that is. And we're going to talk more about what you said with community after Ben, and jump back to Bob to have, you think you're getting off the hook that easy? I mean, come on. So Ben, I'm not even going to ask you a question. You bring such an eclectic background here, and you have such a great beard. You should be able, tell us where you're coming from here.
I'm full California.
I know, it's great. Do you have a mic?
From California.
Yeah, he's a Texan now, can you tell?
Right.
You see how much taller he is?
Yeah. Well, here's an interesting question. How many people have bought a car? Shop for a car. All right. How many people bought a car online? How many bought a car going into the dealership? All right. Now, the question is do you think the salesperson treated you differently based off of your gender, your ethnicity, that you may be a father or a parent? Do you think that happened? Yeah, it does. They have sales scripts if they see a dad with a daughter or a dad with a son. Two different pitches that they're going to give you to buy the beautiful car that's going to make memories on road trips, okay? But we treat healthcare like we're trying to treat everybody the same, with the disease state. And we don't think about individually and stratify our population well enough. And so, thinking about the topic of the next generation of engagement, well, let's figure out where we're at right now. Let's agree at where we're at right now. So Are we at the phase where we have all the information? Do you guys feel like we're at the stage where we have all the information?
No.
Do you have all the information to manage your own health? Okay. How many people have looked at the claims bill when they get it for their insurance, other than when they had to pay, right? Okay, you look at it, right? How many of you understood it? Right? They lump together the bill. They lump together you had an IV drug. They don't even tell you what IV drug you're paying for that you're shelling out for. Okay. Now your payer understands what it is, but you probably don't. Right? The average Joe doesn't, or average Jane don't know it, and that's a problem. So now we're going to give more healthcare information out to folks. We're going to collect it through sensor data, medical devices, connected medical devices. I did a lot of that. Wearables, right? What does that mean to folks? Is it understandable and actionable to them, right? So I was diagnosed with sleep apnea years ago. That was one of the first things. It was, thank God for Qualcomm insurance, right? Because that was an expensive surgery that I went through. So I did the CPAP for a year, and I was 100% compliant other than 2 times I forgot it. So I didn't love it, I hated it, but I spent a year researching what to do to get off that thing. But I had 2 young daughters, I had a wife I love, and I'm like, I am not going to be wearing this thing the rest of my life, if possible. I will if necessary. But I didn't understand what the impact of that was to my health, okay? And I had to have it described. Now, I like to research, so I researched how to do it. But it was so expensive to get off that, so I had a massive surgery, double mandibular advancement. Broke my jaw multiple different places, rebuilt it, pulled my jaw forward 17 millimeters, okay? Now I can breathe at night. All right, but it's like that's what happens when you have a crisis. Okay, if we're trying to shape somebody's behavior, we're trying to help them be, what the impact is. We have to make it so easy for them to understand. And one of my favorite things to kind of pick on a little bit, I guess, is sleep. Okay, because it was so near and dear to my heart. So I wear a wearable. I actually rotate, honestly,
We both
with all wearables. So I have every wearable underneath the sun. And I will tell you this as a side note is if you want to know what the wearable you should pick, you need to tell me what your use case is, right?
Absolutely.
Because they're all different.
Absolutely.
And I wear multiple. Not at the same time. I got friends that do that. That's weird. So the testers, they're weird. But it's based off of your use case. But one of the things I get is how much deep sleep did I have last night, right? And how much light sleep did I have? And I'm like, okay, well that's great, but what does that mean? Nobody's telling me that. Nobody's telling me that based off my age or my demographics, how much deep sleep I should have at night. They're like, oh, get your 8 hours of sleep. Is that enough? Is that too little? Right? And then how much, I get 8 hours of sleep, but if it's light, junky sleep, then, how does that do me, right? And so I think we have to be very targeted about how we give out information to folks. So it's like, if you're going to give out sleep information, tell me why that's meaningful to me. Tell me what the deep sleep means to me. Tell me what ideal is to me. And so I think where we're at is we're just now getting good at collecting data, in our life cycle. Sure. We're just getting good about collecting data through sensors, wearables, personal stuff. And so the flood of information. And it's funny, I hear the term, big data and data scientists, and extremely important. And it just needs to be translated into the most simple terms. Like the newspaper, it's at 5th grade level. And we better be giving out our information about healthcare at that level so people understand what the impact is and then how they can change it, right? That's what I feel like is important.
So Ben, while you're up, so to me, one of the biggest problems is that we're in, and I've shared some of this already, in this patient model, passivity, subservience, the like. And we want to make this where it's sufficiently important, meaningful, or matters to the person.
Yeah.
So we have an initiative in San Diego to reduce cardiac and stroke death. In fact, Daniel, I think you're running the show there in terms of the Be There initiative. So the Be There initiative offers a couple of pictures to get people to be more mindful about what's important to them. And so they have grandpa playing chess with grandson, and slowly grandpa fades out of the picture and is gone. And then we have mom and dad and the 3 kids, and slowly mom fades out of the picture that is gone. And it's not what's your A1C, hemoglobin, blah, blah, blah. It's be there for the ones you love. You know this stuff, don't you? This is about the amygdala, right? Or the deep brain, not about cognitive filtering. So it's got to be something that's important and meaningful to us and understandable. Otherwise, it's just overwhelming. And you also raise the fact, Ben, of the most important thing we can do for our health, which is sleep. Adequately.
Sleep, yeah.
Get the trash out of the brain.
Yep.
Let
Yeah.
the brain become resilient and so on and so forth.
Well, it's understanding like the reconstructiveness of sleep and at the different stages,
Yeah.
right? So yeah, I did the research. I've done my Googling of everything, right? And so I wanted to know what it was for me and understanding each stage. So I go, oh, okay, well, being that light sleep does help me because I was always like, oh, I better be in a deep sleep, right? Or, I'm not,
Yeah, absolutely.
And so it was a misnomer to me. I didn't know. And I don't think
And we don't have to do it all at once either, do we?
No, we don't have to do it all at once.
So I was part of the Surgeon General of the Army's Brain Health Summit, and they had the best sleep researchers from around the world. And one of the guys said something, he says, there's this company, and not to malign them, but just as an example, Microsoft, and they believe that they keep their people working. If it takes 60 hours to finish a project, they will stay awake for 60 hours and get the job done because they're passionate and they're committed. And this Harvard researcher was there and he said, so what do you call a product like that when people are awake for 60 hours? He said, Word. And it's very interesting that those things that are so important we miss. So, will you add more about community a bit, Bob, and talk about what your vision is in terms of how this fits?
Oh, there you go.
So community is just baked into how we see the world. I think that one of the things you pointed out is healthcare is lagging way behind the rest of the world in personalization. We have the capacity, you personalize your dress, you personalize your food, you personalize everything. And so your point is really well taken. I think we've got a long way to go to catch up. But what that also creates is there's an expectation on the other side that it will be personalized. And so there's a huge opportunity to answer that need. So and when we think of community, everything we talked about here, I always have the opposite of a yeah, but. I always think, well, of course there are people that like whatever it is. Of course there are people. Your situation where you said that ad campaign where the key adult disappears. Well, I'll tell you now, 28% of the population could care less about that. So you've just said, if you're using that exclusively as your message, well, 2/3 is good enough. Well, it's not. So how do we make that message known to the people in the right way? And if we know people form communities based on shared points of view, because that way your points are validated. A lot of people talk about our tribal culture today. Well, that's true. And it's because we have the capacity to act on our instincts and create communities. So if we're going to talk to people, we don't have to talk to 328 million people individually. There's enough shared sensibility to create communities and talk to people. And one last thing on community, there's a hospital in New York that we've done some work with that pays $20 million a year in advertising budgets trying to attract people to the hospital. And our whole point was, and you're doing it in one message for everyone. And if we could look at that population based on some reasonable sense of segmentation, build communities before there's an incident, before there's a diagnosis, on behalf of the hospital, you're then in a situation people are more likely when they need it to come to you because you have that relationship.
The interesting thing about community, though, is in a community you still have diversity, right? So, but there is one common thread typically in that community, right? And so it's attaching to the common thread.
Great point. So think of the difference between a narrative and a story. So someone described it to me that, evolution is a narrative, and the story of people hang off that narrative. The story of fish hang off that same narrative. So the narratives are that universal trait. We're able to look at communities based on spectrums of instincts. That becomes, if you're a social binder, that becomes your narrative, and your story hangs off it. If we can identify those stories and use those to aggregate the commonalities and all the variables that go into behavior change, we can be pretty successful. So I think there's some real exciting stuff starting to percolate around community.
Yeah,
So as long as you're on that roll, would you speak a bit about clustering before you jump in? And let's go ahead, Ben, go ahead, and then you can follow, whatever you make.
Well, the clustering process that we're talking about is being able to look at any population. There's 5 or 6 instincts that are distributed across every population in the world. And what's important is that they're not distributed individually, they're distributed in patterns. And we found that there, in North America, for example, 5 recurring patterns of instincts. So now our big data challenge isn't to figure out, in the grand scheme of, billions of bits of data, how are you different, but rather simply which of the 5 are you in. So it's a much simpler data challenge. And then once we know those commonalities, we've identified the words, images, and themes that allow us to engage people with a shared worldview. They're not identical, but they're similar enough to be able to move towards intimacy at scale.
Excellent. You want to add something?
Yeah, no, all I was going to say is that part of the trick is getting people involved enough that you actually have the data. And if, we talk here as sort of an in-group, like everybody's wearing 6 devices, et cetera, et cetera. Again, from a marketing background, go out and look at people in Oklahoma or in, go look at a big office building. They're not people like us. They're not thinking about health and they're not driven. Our goal is to get those people into health light, and then the kind of segmentation that you're talking about may let us get even better at attracting them to particular things that we want them to do. They start off as a community. The community is the company, it's the disease, it's the kids who are on chips. But obviously that community breaks into much smaller communities where we can motivate them to an even greater extent to be engaged, which this is what this is all about. But you got to start attracting them in the first place, otherwise you're talking to yourself.
Pat, you're here.
So part of my challenge is how do you take all of these nuances of segmentation and then overlay that with the complexity of technology and put it into a meaningful conversation to our scientists and ultimately to decision makers, whether they be buying products or paying for certain services. So the challenge is, data's data. When it's unfiltered, it's not very meaningful, but how do you take all of the nuances of what we're talking about and build a case that you can sell to a scientist or a decision maker?
So how do you think you would answer that question?
Well, it's more than just big data. I think it's the context of the data, and it's looking at these different segments and these different approaches. And I still think we have a lot to learn in how these approaches actually roll out. And the same with different technologies. If you're using AI or VR or something like that, how does that actually move the needle? From our perspective, the needle is health outcomes. So, better quality of cardiovascular risk and fewer heart attacks and strokes. So how do we take that conceptual leap from what we're talking about to better health outcomes?
Absolutely.
It's kind of interesting. So we've got, you that has almost like targeting, how to target, right? You're gamifying engagement, right? Content. It's very interesting because they're like pillars in the whole story that needs to transpire. It's an interesting comment about not everybody has a wearable, right? And I always joke with my brother who lives here in the Bay Area. I'm like, you live in a bubble, because he's always talking to me about a new company that's coming up. I'm like, you know, it hasn't reached San Diego yet, and I'm not that far away, right? And so it's a fair point about technology, you know, as in gathering data, and most of the time when technology isn't involved, it's the doctor is really inserting it because they need more visibility into your health as you leave their office, right? Or you had a major event and there's, you know, a durable medical equipment that's going home with you, right? And so we need to solve that gap, almost like a homework gap for kids that don't have internet at home. It's kind of for healthcare, it's the same thing where we have to close that gap.
And I think part of that is actually putting reward programs around the kinds of things we're doing. So we don't expect all these CHIPS kids, for example, to instantly sign up and play. But we're going to give them meaningful rewards for the community that they're in. And you can do meaningful rewards for any community. It can be people who are recovering from a heart attack. You can do it with a little imagination with practically any closed group. And that closed group, of course, becomes a support system. So the other thing I didn't say about our gamification is that as you play, you can see what other people are playing, and there's a sort of a closed Facebook community. People aren't going to share health issues in a public spot, but if they know, for instance, if it's people with PT, post-traumatic stress disorder, I can't say it today, it's from my brain, people who have that and think just that's our closed community, they'll share stuff with each other, which they wouldn't in a public situation. So I think what we're trying, and I said it before, but I think we're trying to be engagement light, but I think if you don't have engagement light and have people think about wellness and how their life can be better by doing some of these things, it's hard to get to the kind of engagement where you can actually really make behavioral changes that are critical for certain people. Is that?
Yeah.
So gamification is, I think, is extremely important. There's another leg to that, I believe, which is payment. Okay, and so I was involved at Qualcomm Life with United Healthcare and a number of different wearables companies that were part of it. But it was a combination of really, it was less gamification, but more about moving dollars. Okay, and so the program is called Motion. The steps, what you would see on your wearable is called FIT, frequency, intensity, tenacity. And so basically what would happen is United would pay you, and basically your employer is underwriting this really, but United would pay you $1 a day in your HSA if you walked 10,000 steps. They pay you another $1 a day if you did 3,000 steps in 30 minutes. They would pay you another $1.50 a day if you got up every hour, don't have to be consecutive, for at least 5 times a day and moved 500 steps inside 7 minutes. And you're like,
And it's 32% of the population that would do that.
yeah.
That's my point.
Yeah. So it's a combination of payment, gamification,
Well,
like you've got to hit.
And just in fairness, when I said gamification, I said a reward system.
Yeah.
If it's a corporation, the reward system can be dollars. It could be, for kids, a movie pass. It could, I mean, you make when you said payment, you really meant a reward system. An appropriate reward system. And I obviously, we all react to that. But I think the other thing you've got to be able to do, which we can do as we go, and again, it's sort of a marketing technique, but try stuff with different parts of the population, learn what they do and don't do, and then adjust it. So while we are if you would, a population health management solution, it's an individual population health management solution because the individual is playing their own way through it and we're watching what they do.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, we really think that all these things get mapped on a, very much like relationships. You don't meet somebody the first time and say, let's get married.
Right.
Hopefully you say, hi, I'm Bob, nice to meet you. Tell me a little bit about yourself. And then you leave the party with a friend and you said, what do you think of so-and-so? What a jerk. You have those instinctual reactions out of the gate. So how do you as a healthcare educator or a motivational entity, how do you take that into account? I think this stuff that you're doing great at that early stage. And then you can intensify the experience as it's warranted based on the depth of the relationship. And so,
You decide
we
when
think
to get married.
yeah, decide. And then when you leave,
So Ben, can you explain how all this fits in with the prenuptial? No, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
So what, you made this move over to the genomic space, why?
Well, I mean, it was a little bit of personal perspective. So it's in pharmacogenomics, focused on how drugs interact with your genes. Okay, and for me, it was personal. My mom passed away a number of years ago of cancer, battled it for 20 years, stage 4 for 7. I mean, just a battler, right? And what I saw was medication she was taking had no worth for her. Okay, and I also saw this whole trial and error of pain management because of side effects from other chemo that she's had, right? Sure. So brunge in the mouth and the bone basically rotting out inside, brunge. I mean, like the worst ever toothache ever going on 24/7. Wow. And, her pain doctor is going through this trial and error. And, some days I'm like, and I'm calling from California to Atlanta and I'm like, oh, she's lost it, right? Because she's over-medicated.
Yeah, polypharmacy.
Oh yeah, polypharmacy, it was just ridiculous. And so, I'm flying out constantly because I'm like, well, this is distress. And it was the medication balance was part of it, right? Pull her off, she's in more pain. But she never had a genetic test to see how medication would be metabolized, tongue-tied, but absorbed into her body, right? Yeah. Well, no, how would it affect her personal genes?
Yes, certainly.
She never had that. And I'm like, that's ridiculous. And it goes on, for oncology and all the drugs there. The new business I'm in, Sequentia, I run business development and product strategy for Sequentia, and one of the early areas that we're focusing on is the perioperative suite. Is before you go into surgery and you're about to get medicated, right, put under, and then post-operative there's going to be care, right? What's the right balance of opioids, and are you going to metabolize that faster or not? Sure. Right?
And I think you can apply that same thing outside of just medications. So we have an Institute for Cardiovascular Precision Medicine, and it's very focused on genomics. But if you apply the behaviors, the segments, all of these other factors, that's also, frankly, a form of precision medicine as well, on a behavioral level.
So is it fair to say that all diseases are rare diseases, or does that not make sense? It may very well be the case.
Well, are they all rare? I mean, it's all personalized.
No question.
Right?
No question.
Right. It's almost like no cancer is exactly alike per person.
Yeah.
And so
listen, I'd like to throw this open to some questions and answers, if that's okay with my panel.
Sure.
Let's do it. Yes, please. Grab a mic, or I can give you one of ours.
Thank you. Hi, Simran. So thank you so much, by the way, this was great. I have one question is, we've talked a lot about different ways that we can engage in gamification and other reward systems. We've seen this, or I've seen it a lot in different kinds of products out there. I wanted to dive a little deeper and get your insights into more about the solutions you're seeing to actually increase or even what may be more important right now is maintaining engagement. I constantly see metrics from startups and companies. Oh, we've been able to keep them on for 90 days and engaged. Or, these metrics that are great, but they're at such a small scale. Are there solutions that you're seeing or that you're maybe working on that you can talk about?
Well, I can talk. I think there are a couple of things. One, there are best practices that have been developed by all these different companies like Facebook and LinkedIn where you're prompted. So we have the ability to prompt people. Someone just looked at what you were doing, someone commented, you haven't played a card today. But I think the other key thing is, and I didn't talk about it a lot, but our actually platform has a sort of a live wall, and that live wall is the community, and people are attracted and come back to community. And on that live wall, we can also feed stuff from the particular host, whoever our client is, so that it almost becomes like a Yahoo or a CNN where things change on a regular basis. So again, you have to move your head from thinking about an app to a community, a wellness community, where there's continuous information, and so you have a reason to go back besides just playing the cards. But interestingly enough, several years after this started, we'd given the card test to one of our investors, and we're actually talking about money again, and the guy went to get some information from a woman in the particular department, and she said, well, who are you working with? And, oh, ILM. She said, oh, I'm still playing the game, and she was just on a sandbox playing cards and been playing it for a year and a bit. So I mean, if you have intriguing information and it's fun, people will go back and play it. I think the problem is that we haven't made health fun. I mean, it's just, you tend to think about it, and it's because some bad things happen, like my accident to your mom. But we've got to make health fun so that people want to engage right from the beginning, and that's very much what ILM's focused on.
So there's more than that too, though, isn't there, Rick? Because we have not lessons from addiction medicine.
Yes.
We have from gaming, from so on and so forth. And maybe it's not just that it's fun. Bob?
Well, one of the things we're looking at is kind of exciting. It's more of a general trend, is these whole evolution of micro-influencer networks. So if you look at any of the social platforms, Instagram in particular, there's probably 10,000 people with 100,000 followers or more. We've started surveying the leaders of those influencer networks, and not surprisingly, most of the followers follow the instinctual approach of the leader.
Yep. And we call them champions.
And so now, if you've got an influencer network in fashion or in travel or in fitness or in any of these, it gives you a robust way to begin to evolve communities by recruiting influencer networks. And because influencer networks tend to have a shared sense or perspective, now you immediately start to get the cluster twos who are interested in fitness, who are interested in forming a community to help evolve their relationships around those topics. So we think there's some exciting, trends in the world writ large.
Just the other thing I was going to say is, we're not perfect, and we're not going to get everybody. So what we're trying to do is move the bar
It's so Canadian.
a small percentage. Isn't it lovely?
Well, I love I've heard the analogy or expression sneezers, right? So, influencers are sneezers, right? So whatever they sneeze out, they're like everybody's getting infected with whatever they're getting, right? So, seeing it's healthcare. Engagement is kind of interesting though, because I don't know, maybe it's just something I heard growing up, but 30 days to make a habit, right? So, if that's true, if it really is just 30 days, and that can seem Herculean in some ways, but if we can get them engaged for 30 days, we probably have a better chance. Now, wearables, we call them wearables or forgettables, right? Because the first rev of the wave of wearables, people bought their Fitbit, they wore for a couple months at best, and they put them away. And fortunately for Fitbit, they were able to resell and others, but because they offered more value, right? They were offering new things that were part of the equation, because now all of a sudden they have text alerts, which for me, that's one of my chief use cases. I don't want to have my phone in front of my face the whole time, but I want to vibrate when I get, important text or it's a calendar. So I know, oh my God, I'm supposed to, okay, quickly I can glance. Oh yeah, I'm supposed to be somewhere. So the use case, the value it brings to me.
I also think engagement means different things to different people. And what we try to do is time an engagement factor with a measurable outcome. So, medication adherence with blood pressure or with weight. So.
Daniel?
So, thank you. It's very helpful. Would you speak, each of you, to how you get physicians engaged? Because really appreciate what you're doing, but the reinforcement really must come from the other side. And it's ideally physicians, caregivers, I'll take caregivers, but speak to physician engagement and what you do there, please.
Go ahead. No, you start. So, I'm not sure I agree with you, Daniel. I certainly think that's important, but I think that, as my friend who's the Chief Medical Officer of the Navy says, he's not trained for health anyway. He's trained to identify disease and illness, and because of that, he's not the right person to go to for your health. So I think we need to kind of rethink that equation. You're, however, in an interesting position because you're coordinating an effort in San Diego where you're bringing together all the physician communities and all the hospitals in a manner of coopetition to make a difference in people's diseases and their lives.
As well as their health.
As well as their health. But that's different. But I think that we get too caught up with the physician being the pivot. The person's the pivot. Don't let me push you in a corner. Keep going if you want.
But it's got to be reinforced by the physician.
What do you
The
think?
physician doesn't reinforce the wearable or the gamification.
So, I think the physician is an influencer for many people.
Right.
It's not equally an influencer for everybody. Some more than others. But the physicians still are an important stakeholder. And that's why, from our perspective, we really focus on the science. So, what does the science tell us about the behavioral approaches as well as the genomics and the medications? So I think we have to have a scientific approach to this, otherwise it's going to be very difficult for these key influencers to adopt.
Yeah, so last time I checked, physicians are people too. And the cluster theory works on them as well. We've actually started to see different specialties and subspecialties attract people with different instinctual points of view. So I think it's both ends of the communications continuum.
You knew you were going to win on this one, Daniel, didn't you?
So,
Well, we haven't found the secret,
so I'll make a quick.
No, in fairness.
right? I mean, it's a two-sided coin. If you want engagement on the patient side, you've got to have engagement on the physician side. Right. If you want for sickness,
Absolutely.
or wellness, or health.
Absolutely.
It's got to be both sides.
Yes.
What's important to you have to stratify doctors too, right? And what motivates them. So it is money, right? Am I gonna get reimbursed for looking at wearable data, for the patient? Or connected health? It may be, BGM, it may be, glucometer, it doesn't matter. It's like, are they gonna get reimbursed? And now there is reimbursement for it. So there is a code for it, so they can get reimbursed. I think it's like $69 a month for looking at the data for 30 minutes. 30 minutes, okay? I think it's $69, maybe $59, but there is a reimbursement. So for those, they can put a nurse practitioner to look at all the data, maybe use some AI, maybe use SAMD, software as a medical device, to help to bring out some real decision support. So that could trigger the financial side of the model for them, if that's what drives them. Some may be care, right? Some may be ego, some may be, I want to be the best in my field. So you have to stratify it and what motivates them. And it's interesting because it's how the patient feels about the doctor too. Some doctors, that's important, like the relationship they have with the doctor. So it's not an easy one. There's no panacea for this one.
So, and
Just
one other-
to add a point, so Jim Malt, Qualcomm's Life's medical director, when this first happened, says
Yep.
that if you employ that nurse practitioner, or just a nurse who can
Yep.
do it, in the practice, it's worth $237,000 per nurse that you add into the practice. Go ahead,
Yeah.
Dan.
I was just going to make a quick point too, and that is, as capitation or shared risk comes in, particularly where you're dealing with Medicare or Medicaid or CHIP
ACOs.
schemes, any of these kinds of things, that doctor is going to be looking after the patients for a long period of time, and anything he can do to make them healthier over a long period of time makes him more profitable. So there is a follow the dollar, which didn't exist so much before.
Agreed, especially the stratification point. So the focus should be primary care. Because when you look to health and wellness over time, to the stratification point, ED docs, they don't matter. Cardiologists, it's a sliver, surgeons, but primary care should be the focus of the engagement.
But some doctors will want you to come to their office, and some are okay with e-visits, right?
And I can reinforce things over e-visits.
Absolutely, super easy, right? I mean,
Exactly.
your dashboard with the patient's record, with all the wearable stuff, maybe some decision support in there. It can be super easy for the doctor, but they have to be inclined to absorb it, right?
And as you get to the community level, I love arguing with Dennis about person-centric. Person-centric just isn't me. It's my family. It's my block.
It's your tribe.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
It's how that's described. And once we start to address that properly, then I think we can really influence change.
Well, I mean, I'm not going to speak for Dennis, but I mean, I think that, well, I probably am. But, people-centric, health-centric, it's not about the health, it's about, do I get up and do I feel good about life? So it's behavioral, it's my emotional, it's my mental, it's my physical, right? All of that. And then you think about health of like, what's keeping me from doing the things I love, right? So I think that's kind of one of your mantras. What keeps you from doing the things you love, right?
But you can map the flow of information in that complex network. So if that primary care physician, say, pick a cluster 2, is communicating with a cluster 3 patient, chances are that needs to be flagged because that communication is not going to go well. There could be literal exchange of information, but there's a high risk of it not going well. So in that case, maybe you do bring in a nurse to translate literally for the doctor to the patient. But that's the degree of specificity we can get into in mapping networks of the flow of information based on, and you take a primary care physician talking to his subspecialist in orthopedics. If they don't share a point of view.
But this is the work that has to get done. I completely agree with you, right? But we need to start doing the mapping and figure out what the results are.
Are you in San Diego?
I am.
I'll stop by.
Okay.
Let's have lunch. Go ahead.
Hello, thank you for this wonderful dynamic discussion. I want to take the kind of direction of discussion to a different level, as it seems to me technology itself is a little ahead of the general population. It's like answers looking for questions in actually changing our behavior. That's one. The other question is how all these solutions, wearables, apps, and everything that seems to be helping, trying to be helpful, can really impact our early development and behavior at the very earliest stages. And I'd like to hear your perspective.
Well, that's exactly what we're trying to do with this initial big program that we're involved in. It's a CHIPS program. It's aimed at kids, obviously, and if you can get them just adapting a number of habits early in their life over the lifetime of doing a few things differently, that can make a big difference on the cost of healthcare, but also the actual pleasure that they have in their life, to echo a lot of Dennis's theory.
Yeah, we have a program called One Brave Idea, which instead of making incremental changes, it's a big leapfrog change, and it really focuses on early development of cardiovascular risk.
Yeah, I would agree. In some areas we are ahead with technology. In other areas, I feel like it has to get there faster because it's going to help the average person understand what the data is and why it's important to them. So you got wearable data, what does that really mean to you, right? Like how fast is your heart recovering, and if you're training for a race, right? How fast is your heart recovering, and when can you do your next workout? To the person that's just going off the couch, couch to 5K, and they're feeling terrible, but they're trying to do something right. Their wife nudged them enough times to get off the couch, and they need real coaching. And coaching, I think, one of the other, you mentioned physicians. I think another element, and it may sound a little too techish, but chatbots and the content behind chatbots is going to help folks also, I believe, from a perspective of it's anonymous, it's interactive, and in somewhat, to me, more privacy for me than I'm talking to a person, but yet I can get content directed specifically to my questions in an interactive way. So I think that would be an interesting help for us for patient engagement.
Two final questions. I just want to make one comment. One of the things I find working with natural language processing and AI, with people that use like Alaska Airlines, Merrill Lynch, Avatar, find that people often like talking to the agent, the virtual agent, more than they do another person, which is kind of interesting if it's good information. Go ahead.
So this is a follow-up based on the comment about the focus on physicians. And I think the previous question as well. So don't we just need to look at the pharmaceutical industry as a model of how the efficacy of being physician focused, and then what needs to change with our health systems? So if these innovations are effective, how can they be prescriptive and, you know, be part of a person's health solutions that comes from their physicians? Like, what needs to change? Is it the financial incentives, and then how do you see, you know, kind of bridging that gap?
Well, I definitely feel like doctors should be incented more to engage in what happens outside their office. Like, I think the incentives need to be bolstered there, because if you can set people on a path, they are going to be healthier, right? If they feel like the doctor is, you know, and somewhat hasn't forgot about them when they go home, right? I think that's important. So the doctor could be sending prompts through a televisit, or hey, you know, I've noticed something. It's time to come in.
You're also, sorry, I was just going to say, you're also getting care groups now, so the doctor is now, instead of just alone, he's often with other people who are health-oriented. And so I think in the end you can't count on the doctor to do everything, but I think their practices will evolve to where wellness becomes a more significant part of it. And I was talking to a friend, Dave Serino, who was on the panel yesterday, and you know, at Providence they're trying to put groups together that offer solutions and care. It's a long haul, but I think that's what will happen in the next generation. You won't just go to the doctor, you'll go to a care group.
And one of the challenges and traps of comparing this to the pharmaceutical is you can control for a pharmaceutical and do, you know, a randomized clinical trial. It's very difficult to do the same type of study with technology or with a very nuanced, segmented behavioral approach, because you're always innovating. And to say, well, stop innovating while we do this study, just obviously is a non-starter. So it's challenging.
One last thing, just is, you know, there are well-defined innovation curves, disbursement curves. And the real thing, if we're going to use groups and communities, is who goes first is really important for establishing authority and by opinion leaders. So if you start with just getting 1,000 people into an early trial, that often doesn't do any good with the disbursement of the innovation. So you've got to be able to define who should go first, because they're going to be early adopters and they're going to also be authoritative in their opinions, which will allow innovation to spread.
And Dennis, quick question though. So for the audience though, how many folks, when they're feeling sick, they go to the doctor or versus going to the local pharmacy? Like, when you're feeling like you're coming down with a cold, do you call your doctor or do you go to the pharmacy first? Right. It's a component that we don't talk about all that often, which is the pharmacist. Okay? It's so easy to get access to your local pharmacy. They are giving out information. They are encouraging patients with a cold or a chronic condition. When you go in, you're like, hey, I'm feeling like this. What do you recommend?
Particularly in rural communities.
Absolutely. Access.
Hi, my name is Mike Meyer. I focus on primary care and comorbid health, but with a bend towards mental health. And I want to see if I can ask a question that you can all tie together for me. But Dr. Dunn, you get it first. I'm an unmanaged anxiety case. I'm 30% more likely to have a heart attack and 30% more likely to die from it. United Healthcare emotionally said they spend 30% of their money on heart attacks. So, since mental health, which is a factor, I work in primary care, cardiology, that lives pretty much in primary care too in the first round. How are you guys looking at the concept of integrating all these different measures, monitors, numbers, and how can it go from being predictive to proactive? Can you switch it from just being an information point to an action point?
Great question, and I have to answer that in two ways. We being the AHA or we being me personally, because, you know, in some ways, you know, the organization is not quite there yet. I do think that the mental health and the emotional status of the patient really should be at the top of the list. And that's where you should start in designing your care plan and designing your approach. It shouldn't be the result of afterwards. So I do agree with you, but it's going to take more science, frankly, to get to the rest of the organization there.
Go ahead, please.
Hi, Dave Haddock with Psychoanalytics. I think all of us in this room are working in healthcare because of intrinsic value. But how do you build a sustainable business? What happens when a grant runs out? How do you bridge from, funding into ROI?
One of the interesting things that we've tried to do is with the focus on community. Once you have a million people gathered around a common interest, anytime you have a million people together, there are way more people interested in accessing that group than just the people for the original purpose. So we think that in that New York hospital example, that for us to touch 2.2 million people that is in their footprint and start to talk to them about the broad lifestyle notion of survivorship, well, that encompasses probably 10 huge market sectors beyond that hospital. So that's how we sustain the communities. We make a multivariate approach.
So Bob, can I push on what you just said? Because I don't agree with you, and you don't agree with me. But we need to agree. How do we deal with that?
It's very interesting. So if we're at different points of view in terms of instincts and our tribal point of view, take, for example, the topic of climate change. We may have extremely different opinions. You think it's a hoax, I think it's the Bible. We're not going to change each other's opinion. If I raise my voice, you're not going to change your opinion. If I demean you as unhuman, you're not going to change your opinion. But we've found in that situation, if you find a different organizing principle, both sides can abandon that sense of needing to be right, and maybe we just agree to better stewardship because we've all can agree it's better to clean up after yourself. So that's an example of reorienting a conflict to a new position of mutual benefit.
That's very, very, very exciting stuff. By the way, back to Ben's discussion earlier, I didn't sleep well last night. I had 6 hours of sleep. 6 hours of sleep is being equivalent to being between 16 and 7% intoxicated. So the example before I gave you about Microsoft had to do with Windows and not Word. I completely blew it. And I also thought we were ending at 10. We're ending at 10:15, so we still have more time for questions. So blame it on the sleep. Go for it. And then you're next.
Thanks. This is for Bob. You talked about 5 or 6 instincts, but you never mentioned what they were.
No, they're really secret. So they're kind of obvious when you hear them. We measure.
Can you whisper, please?
5. How instinctually, how important is your urge to care for children? And the way that ties back to survival is, when we came off the planes and started living in groups, if you nurtured children or if your group survived, you had a better chance of survival. Fairness and reciprocity in your relationships is another one. Loyalty to your group of origin is the third one, and that's a real vexing one. That causes a lot of trouble in culture, as you can imagine. Comfort in hierarchical authority is the fourth one. There's a king of the clan, and if you're comfortable with that, and winners and losers, that's cool. The fifth is one that originated as omnivores. It was very difficult to figure out what was edible, and that morphed into kind of a cleanliness, avoid the taboos of culture. You see it a lot either in strong codes of, say, religious codes, or if you're a bad guy, omerta could be a code that you would adopt to, but that structured sense of avoiding taboos. So those 5 are the base instincts, and we know that they are distributed in patterns. And so sometimes one neutralizes another, and sometimes it enhances it. So that's hence the notion of 5 mixes or patterns of people.
So before the next question, so earlier when you started talking, you talked about you're driven by the ideal of a moral imperative. So given what you can do, why is the moral imperative so important?
Well, because I think if you look at it, Scientific American just did a study a year ago where they looked at topics that you're willing to change your mind on. And clearly, the vexing issues of our culture are the ones you're not. So it's war and peace, it's immigration, it's abortion, it's climate change, and those are driven by your instinctual point of view around morality. When you get to those neutral things like, what color should the car be, you can negotiate on that. It's not as intimately tied to your morality. And that really feeds our analysis of ambivalence. So when you're out on the thing about climate change, there's very little ambivalence, single-digit ambivalence. But we looked at the banks of Canada, and the top 5 banks of Canada, there's 52% ambivalence across all 5. People just don't care.
It's interesting the things that you will change your mind on, that used to be taboo. And I'll give you a prime example, Airbnb. Who would you have thought years ago that you would allow some stranger to sleep on your couch or rent a room in your home when you're not there? I mean, I do house trading too. There's a site called Home Exchange. I trade houses with folks. Like, I want to go to Paris, I let somebody from Paris stay in my house. Who would have thought that people would do that years ago? We've changed the way what used to be taboo.
And cluster 2s went first on that.
Next question, please.
Excellent panel and discussion. Thank you for that. I have a question about the low-income community. How do you address that when they're not digitally oriented and when the doctors are not just, adopting to these type of innovation?
Yeah, for us, we mapped populations, and we've actually we found that through continual research, we continue to find markers, observable markers of behavior that predict which instincts are important to you. So we can link it to the big public data sets, because somebody like Experian has 300 million profiles. They track 1,600 attributes. Well, our 122 are in those 1,600. So almost everybody we can figure out with a degree of accuracy which cluster you're in if we're sorting based on that. So those are some of the data-centric approaches that we've got to be able to apply our model to map any community.
And for us, the last phrase of our impact goals is for all Americans. So everything that we do, it has to be across the board. It can't just be for the wealthy people that can own a smartphone. That being said, there are a lot of low-income people that use, technology. They'll use a flip phone or they'll use a smartphone as their computer. So there are still applications, but we do have to design it for everybody.
So what's the number of smartphones that people use around the world? Is it 6 billion now?
Yeah, and also there's so many programs now to bring smartphones to, it's the old Lifeline government, so there's, it is getting there. I mean, believe me, there's a lot of people that have iPhones that shock me, right? So, that are paid for by tax dollars, so, and TrackPhone, the guy, has an amazing contract with the US government to give out cellular service.
Varun, please.
I had a question. You had brought up the idea of what is the right metric or goal to set for individuals for sleep, whether it's deep sleep, REM sleep, and that idea in general, steps even, like what is the right step? Should you be taking 10,000 steps? So there's a question of what goal to set, and also my question really is, how do you get qualitative feedback from the user themselves? They are going to be one of the best people to tell you, I took 10,000 steps, do I feel active? Do I feel like I'm healthy? Or more importantly, I had 7 hours of sleep, do I actually feel rested? I had 9 hours of sleep, do I actually feel rested? And so in machine learning, you have supervised learning where somebody looks at the data and says, oh, this is how we train the model. Why aren't we using qualitative data from the actual end user? And how do you see that being applied in the future?
Yeah, so it's a little bit of a combo. So one is the information about how much sleep you need versus somebody else is really not out there. At least I haven't found it. Like, they have these standards 8 hours. But understanding the quality of your sleep and why it happens. So we have to get feedback of why you didn't sleep well. And so are you going to take a survey? so how am I going to get you, and that's where the kind of gamification is, they get you to add more content to your picture. So did you drink alcohol? Did you take any, ibuprofen before you went to bed? Because those affect your sleep, right?
And I'll add to that. I think we're so goal obsessed, and I think it's more, do you feel well? And did you feel you had a good sleep? No one fits into whatever the true story is, because the true story is your story. And I think what we're trying to do, at least in our platform, is say, do things that work for you. And I think, obviously, because everyone here is in the business, you've got to have norms and goals and all those kinds of things to determine what groups do. But on an individual basis, what a good night's sleep for you might be totally different than me. Some people seem fine on less hours, others don't.
So why don't you think like Fitbit or Apple Watch, why don't they ask you qualitative questions like yes and no?
I can't hear.
He's saying, so why doesn't Apple or Fitbit or Garmin offer you, ask the question of, is this good enough for you? Is that fair, Varun?
Something like, it's a
They should.
I think they are making investments in engagement platforms. So just so you know, like Fitbit has done some acquisitions recently. So they are making investments in getting that interact. But on the device itself, remember, you want to keep it chimp simple, right? And so you're pulling, not a lot of pushing in, right? Because it's not a great interface for adding data.
So we haven't have an expert on this, answering this question. He'll be speaking next, but he's going to share a little insight now.
Oh, okay. No, it was a perfect, actually, segue to my talk on circadian rhythms. I think the question of just surveying patients and saying, how does it feel subjectively is a start. I'm going to mention a few other, or challenge us all to consider a few other ways of diving deeper into the question of how much sleep is right.
Including the correlation between PTSD and sleep.
Exactly.
Yeah. Cool. We have a last, I think this is really the last question. Thanks, Jerry.
My question is on sustaining engagement. Community forums aren't for everyone. Financial rewards are great if they're attached to prompts, but not everybody's going to be attracted to those solutions. So one, how are you tracking success? So what are some sample metrics that you're using? Is it 20%? Continued engagement is good for you? And two, are you coming up with other solutions, and are any of those coming from the users themselves?
Michael.
The answer is that we're looking for continuing feedback from the users. We get high engagement, so the initial engagement for us is of the people that are invited to participate in the program, how many do, and traditionally, a long time before we came along, it was, particularly in sort of EAP programs and stuff, it was 10 to 15%. We're getting 60 to 70% of people who are invited start playing. And then of that, approximately 40% come back every week. So you can't, we haven't been out long enough to give you the kind of answers that you're looking for, but it is a continuous improvement thing. And once you've got people engaged, and particularly with some of the information we're even learning here, I think we'll be able to sustain it. But you're never going to get 100% of the population, and that's what I was sort of, I guess I was being Canadian, but you've got to be realistic about what you can achieve.
And we look at by cluster, by behavior, baselines. So what is it now? And how do we grow off of what it is now? And so whether we're talking about return visits, we're talking about judged, success, whatever it is, but it's by cluster, by behavior, off of baselines is
So
typically how
we have a psychiatrist and an anxiety person in the wings. We're leaving. Thank you.